As soon as Israel concluded its military campaign in Gaza, the country launched itself into a different campaign for elections. Inevitably, the war has featured highly in that political campaign, with many parties competing for the security vote. Israel as a nation has shifted to the right. People are disillusioned with a peace process that appears to be going nowhere. And the Israeli politician who appears poised to benefit most, Benjamin Netanyahu. Opinion polls carried out at the height of the war in Gaza indicated that more than 80% of Israelis supported the military campaign. That says a lot about the attitude of Israelis to war and the importance of military strength for their national identity. The timing of the war was no coincidence. With elections looming, politicians of all persuasions were united in their determination to capitalize on public support for an invasion of Gaza. Lior, a reservist paratrooper, speaks for many Israelis when he attempts to justify the war.
Even when we left Lebanon and Gaza, we were still hit by terror. There wasn't an Israeli force on the ground of Lebanon and no Israeli force on the ground of Gaza, but we still had Qassams aimed on populated areas, kindergartens and schools. I am a citizen first of all, then a soldier, and I know this is not right, and I know something has to be done.
2.5 years before the war on Gaza, Israel fought a ruinous war in Lebanon, where its stated aim had been to obliterate Hezbollah. Despite a death toll of over 1,000 people, it failed to do so. The Israeli military took the blame for this miscalculation, and in Gaza, it was determined to learn from its mistakes.
Then what happened from the Israeli perspective? We did 2 unilateral withdrawals, one in Gaza, one in Lebanon. The vacuum was filled by Hamas and Hezbollah, right? So then there was a war with both of them. Tragically, the experience of the unilateral withdrawals in these two fronts, the rise of radical movements entering the vacuum, created a shift in a population, in Israeli population to the right.
The main right-wing party, Likud, is expected to be the single biggest beneficiary of this shift to the right. Ironically, they've benefited from a perception that the incumbent centrist Kadima party didn't go far enough in Gaza.
We think that it was a golden opportunity, not just to punish Hamas or to deter Hamas, but to put an end to this Iranian regime, to this Iranian military outpost that is growing on our southern border. And for this aim, we had to proceed to take control of Gaza in its entirety and to destroy and to eliminate Hamas.
The victory of the Palestinian Islamist party Hamas at the 2006 parliamentary elections in the West Bank and Gaza was a great shock to Israel. It refused to deal with the new administration and closed Gaza's borders completely when Hamas strengthened its grip on the territory. Repeated Hamas rocket fire into southern Israel has solidified public opinion across Israel's political spectrum.
Here, because to large parts of the population and even within the left, people who live in kibbutzim on the border with Gaza, and they call you and they say, are you going to demonstrate? We're still getting, rockets are falling on us. You know, that makes you think twice.
Although Gaza is only about an hour's drive from Tel Aviv, the two places are worlds apart. Because of Israel's long-term closure of the Strip, Gazans' contact with the outside world is minimal, and their suffering can go unnoticed. Even Israel's left wing seems to have little grasp of the realities inside Gaza. For them, Hamas's success is a proof of Palestinian hatred towards Israel rather than a reaction to Israeli policies in the Palestinian territories.
The Israeli public does not know the Gazan population and doesn't, as well as it knows the West Bank population. That's one point. Second, there's much less sympathy for a population that votes in a government which turns out to be a government that doesn't recognize your state and uses violence and terrorist activities against your state.
Whatever the motivation, Israel's response has been widely condemned as disproportionate. But few Israelis share that view. According to this group of Israeli-Palestinian students, the strong support for the war on Gaza was a result of years of indoctrination. It was inevitable.
There was, in the last 3 years, a demonization of Hamas, a demonization of people of Gaza. They described the Hamas as monsters, as people who are just want to kill, want to just killing without any reason. And this was a brainwash of the Israeli people. So when the war came, the support was almost automatic.
It seems that the Israeli Palestinians are almost the only dissenting voices in the country.
All of our population were against the war, against the Israeli aggression, against the Israeli crimes. And there was the biggest demonstrations since 60 years. 150,000 people demonstrated in Sachin against the war. We are only 1.2 million people. It's just like 15 million people demonstrating in Egypt, if you want to take the percent.
There were a few demonstrations by Israeli students against the war. But in the aftermath of the ceasefire, there has been severe criticism of Tzipi Livni, the foreign minister and leader of the Kadima party, for not going far enough in the battle to topple Hamas. In this recent meeting with students in Jerusalem, just days after the ceasefire, Livni did not mention Gaza even once, perhaps fearful that it could harm her chances in the forthcoming election. The biggest talking point that night was the orchestrated stunt by a Greenpeace activist dressed as a polar bear. But it's Livni who could soon find herself out in the cold. This political shift to the right in Israeli society is likely to create another beneficiary, the far-right party Yisrael Beitenu. The party is barely 10 years old, but it might eclipse the Labour Party, one of Israel's longest established political groups. The former Israeli ambassador to the US is one of its leading members.
Likud and Bibi Netanyahu will form the government. Probably they will have around 28 or 30 members of Knesset out of 120. I think that Kadima and Labour will go down, both in their number of seats. I think Israel Beitenu, my party, will do very well, and I believe we will have in the upper teens, maybe up to 18, which will lend itself into a right of center government, which will be strong on defense.
The promise of peace and security through tougher military action is the main theme in Israeli politics today. Benjamin Netanyahu, who's expected to be the next prime minister, promises an iron fist when dealing with anyone considered an enemy of Israel. Hamas is his main target.
If we want to remove the threat of missiles coming from Gaza, we have no choice but to remove the government of Iran and the rule of Iran in Gaza. Either you remove this tumor or you close all the flow of blood into the tumor.
The jubilation at the punishment meted out to Hamas is unmistakable to this group of soldiers. But for Netanyahu followers, the current government didn't go far enough in Gaza. Even though the figures for casualties suggest otherwise, Israelis argue that the war was not fought against the Palestinian people, but only against Hamas.
You know, you can expect Israel to tolerate many things. But you cannot give an assistance or even open your borders, in my view, with a regime that call for your total destruction. It's not a dispute about arrangements between us and the Hamas. It's an existential.
Some would argue this was not a fair fight. But as always, Israel has perceived itself as a vulnerable David, surrounded by a Goliath Arab Middle East. This image hasn't changed despite a highly sophisticated weapons arsenal unmatched by any Arab country.
In the history since 48, there was no one case in which Israel was David. Israel was always Goliath, even in 48. And in this war, the Palestinians in Gaza have nothing. And Israel is one of the strongest states in the world. So who is Goliath here and who is David?
With the obvious disparity of power between Hamas and Israel, some Israelis ask similar questions. But for them, it doesn't turn Hamas into a David.
Here, you're fighting a highly successful David, and a David which makes it impossible for people to live in the south of Israel, closes down schools, wounds and kills people for 8 years. Daily life, no country can tolerate that.
To present the war as a just cause, Israelis have found new ways of framing the conflict by placing the war on Gaza in a wider regional context.
It's interesting, you know. Depends how you measure it. If it's Israel with Hamas, then Israel is a Goliath, right? But if it's Israel and it's not Hamas, Hamas is a proxy of Iran and other forces, then Israel is a David.
Palestinian Israelis look at the story from an entirely different angle.
The Israeli officials, especially Tzipi Livni and Olmert and Barak and others, are saying we are not against Palestinians. Good Palestinians, I call it the KK policy, kissing the good Palestinians and killing the bad ones. This is the Israeli policy now. They have negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. They are the good people, but Israel is saying something very dangerous. These negotiations with the Palestinian Authority give us the right to punish Gaza. So the Israeli strategy was to make the life of people in Gaza untolerated, like hell.
A strategy that didn't quite work out. Despite a shaky ceasefire, Hamas continued firing rockets and Israel continued raiding Gaza. Both claimed they were merely defending themselves.